Welcome to Silence, where we explore the alchemy of disciplines, practices, and beliefs that get us to our best thinking, insights, and creativity. Now, onto the show. Danielle, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks for coming on today.
It's a pleasure.
We're on a Friday in December. Feels merry and bright out there in the air. I feel like I'm finally getting the Christmas cheer in my step. So thank you. Why don't we start? Why don't you just tell everybody who you are, like a little bio? And you can define that however you want. So it doesn't have to be a strict like CV bio, but you can certainly do that. And you've got one that is pretty impressive. But however you want to define Danielle.
Well, I always start at the beginning, which is I am from Chicago. That feels a very core and integral part of who I am, who my family is. So I grew up in the cold and then fled it as soon as I was able. I've lived all over from going to school at Wake Forest, North Carolina, to living in D.C., Columbus, Ohio, Chicago again, New York, San Francisco, and then about 8 years ago, we decided to come to what now feels like home, which is Atlanta. And I would say professionally in that time, I have been all over the map as well. Started in consulting and spent a number of years working on sales and marketing consulting, trying to figure out how to make companies faster, smarter, better, more effective at what they were doing. And that was an interesting tour de force of different cultures and organizational structures and leadership styles. I then was recruited by one of my clients to go work for them and start up a new division. And that has been a part of my story, has been starting new things within big entities. So I worked for the Hartford for a number of years, and then we were bought by Prudential. So I've spent the last 11 years at Prudential, working in a number of different like creative and analytical capacities. So worked in customer experience, in sales, believe it or not, in leading the direct-to-consumer startup business within that organization. So it's been a lot of really fun iterations in bringing digital experiences to life and trying to iterate to make them sharper, make them better, make them help more people. So that's my professional life. Personally, I'm a mom. I have 3 kids who are
awesome kids
who are not so feels like not so little anymore, but in this real sweet spot of 10, 9, and almost 6, and have been married for almost 17 years to the incomparable David, and we have had a really fun story and marriage together over those years. We certainly like our share of adventures. And I would say personally, I've always been someone who kind of lives in the integration of analytical and creative. Like I really love being around creative people. I love creative spaces. I've always loved art history, English, that these are the things I choose to study, I choose to gravitate to. And it happens very naturally. But I also am very interested in picking things apart, figuring things out, solving problems, and ultimately driving change that matters.
That's good. Well, I want to pull on that thread because that jumped out of you do have this, and I want to get into this deeply creative side. I would be interested to know, as I've gotten older, I feel like creativity is more interesting and important to me. But so how did you end up in like strict, intense corporate America with this, creative part to you that's pretty strong? Like, how did you choose one path over the other, or why?
Well,
was it just what you're supposed to do when you're coming out and looking for?
I think there's absolutely a practical element to it, but there's also an identity grappling that I've worked through over the years and continued to work through. I don't know that I've got it solved. I think early on in my career, it almost felt like a betrayal of self to be in a space that was so business oriented when, if I had to define who I am, it really isn't rooted in that. the financial services industry is almost the last place I would have placed myself, if given a blank sheet of paper 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So there was a dissonance there that I really was trying to work through and pay attention to. And I think I had to come to this, come to terms with the parsing of what is the role that my job plays in my life. Is it an expression of my identity, or is it an enabler to the life and lifestyle that I want? And I think I found that actually through experimenting and trying. I actually went back to New York for a while. I, went to NYU, did a certificate in art business. I almost went the route of, working for galleries, spent some time there. I interned with a gallery in London when I was in college. Like I did dabble in that space. And I think I found a few things. One, the more I attached money and my survival and economics to the things I love, the more it felt like it corrupted them and really like shape-shifted the nature of the role that they played in my life. And it became like a more stressful, less pure thing, which isn't bad. Like it's a path and there's ways to work through that. But that was interesting to feel the alchemy of how that reacted within me. And then also there was a real reckoning of like, I may like this space, but I'm actually not good at that thing. Like when I tried to live in those spaces, like it felt disconnected in a different way, like more internally. And so, and interestingly, as I lived into the business world, I found like, maybe this isn't the space I would have naturally chosen, but I'm good at these things. And there's like resonance with that. And so I kind of came to this place of trying to reconcile the idea that like my identity is much more holistic and bigger than my job. And my job, and if I find something that is close enough to what I'm good at and things I like, maybe a degree of separation from the core, but not so far off that I'm like in the wilderness. As long as I can kind of live in that space, it actually has been a way of both nurturing the strengths that I have and being economically rewarded in a way that enables me to pursue the things I really love that feed me.
Yeah. Two important things that I think about in that. One, I'd actually heard David articulate that, but I didn't know that was the same for you of, just this perspective of separating my identity from what I do, and that I do enjoy my work, but it's kind of a means to a larger identity in life. So I think that's an important takeaway. I know you guys have been inspiring to others in our community in that perspective, because that's a hard question to wrestle with. And then it leads me to the second of, in college one summer, I went out to Idaho, to work in a fly fishing shop because I loved fly fishing. And I saw the same thing. It was all these folks that loved fly fishing so much. And of course, I was just there for the summer, but they had come out and made it their livelihood. Mm-hmm. And it's like they didn't love it as much anymore. It became, what was once beautiful kind of became their master in a not inspiring way. And it was a great lesson to me of, not that it never works, but kind of keep your hobbies or your inspirations or creative outlets separate. There's like a purity and beauty to letting them be on their own and not the source of income. So anyway, it's interesting to hear that. Well, two, like you're so multifaceted. You're one of the brightest people I know. Everybody looks up to you in that way. And then you have this deep creative vein, which, some folks probably have known a long time. I think a lot of us have discovered lately in your poetry, which is amazing. I wish I had the URL so I could direct everybody to it in front of me. And then as I was thinking about it, it's like the other, I think, superpower you have is this extremely high EQ. Like you've got a very sensitive soul. And yet, I wouldn't want to be on the other side of the negotiating table from you. Like you can be, you can be, you get stuff done and you have this intensity for business, and yet you've got this high EQ that we see, I guess I experience mostly, in kind of friendship life, but that I've got to imagine plays in to your professional life and helps you be successful. So maybe that's just an observation, but is that something you're in touch with? Do you think about that as a superpower? Or is it like, yeah, that's just who I am and I don't give a lot of thought to it? Like, how's EQ play into the equation?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Well, first of all, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I mean, I feel that EQ is essential to the equation. And yeah, I do think about it a lot. I think we all only know one way of life, which is the body we're in, the mind we're in. And so sometimes I assume that everyone else is seeing and thinking the same things. But no, I feel a lot. I live in a sea of emotions. And actually, it was really fascinating. A few years ago, I felt like, even through conversations with you and Rachel, like it was interesting to realize that people don't think of me as emotional or like see me as emotional necessarily because I'm not volatile. Like I'm not riding a roller coaster of emotions on the outside, but I swim in that sea internally. And I think I love experiencing the depths of that. I think it is valuable, and it's hard to pinpoint exactly where and how that shows up and the power it has, but it's something I'm grateful for. I don't wish I was numb to it. I'm thankful to be able to, drop down the well and excavate things and, try and make connections and bring them back to the surface. And I think that helps in processing a lot because things are rarely surface level in any forum, in your life, in, your reactions to things, in business. Like there are so many variables to the equation. And the more you can be sensitized to pick up on the personal variables at play, as well as motivations and, history and context. The context just matters so much. So,
so go a little further. Like, how has it helped specifically in corporate world? I mean, it makes sense in the context of your creative side. Mm-hmm. One thing that just jumped to mind is one of the pieces I was reading about AI kind of said, AI is going to have the IQ piece, like it's going to beat us in that pretty soon. Mm-hmm. But EQ, it won't. And so they were highlighting that as a
interesting,
differentiator. But how have you seen that EQ and I don't want to frame it as emotion, but I think there's like this sensitivity to emotions that's a piece of it. How has that helped you in straight line corporate America?
Yes. I think two ways come to mind. Number one is so I've spent a number of years working in customer experience. And in fact, when that was a very nascent field, when nobody really knew how to define it, when, people weren't really thinking of the customer, it wasn't a differentiator. It wasn't.
Which is surprising.
I know, it's wild.
Like that, yeah.
It's wild. But, I saw that transition. I lived that transition. And I think one of the things that was so important in creating that transition was building empathy. And so it's very easy for organizations to think inside out, to think this is how we do things. Therefore, how it lands on people doesn't matter so much. Yeah. And we actually had a challenge a number of years ago where it was like $1 billion threat. And to solve it, we had to pick apart, all the financial pieces and all the reasons why things were built the way they were, but then also what's the human aspect of it. And so taking time to listen to customers' reactions and feedback, even to the point of like listening to calls or sending surveys and like getting actual open-ended comments or hearing their tone of voice, like that makes a difference. And then marrying that with what are we actually sending? What are they actually receiving? What are they seeing? What is eliciting this reaction? Or what are we not doing that's then eliciting these reactions? And then marrying all those things together to try and figure out what's the pinpoint of the problem, and then how might we solve it differently? So there was a moment where, part of the problem was we weren't talking enough to customers. You'd have one interaction, and then 10 years later, you'd show back up. So part of the way of making that case was actually to print, not just say, here's a deck with 3 bullet points and, the stats around it, which is an important and necessary analytical point of view, but also let me put in front of you a piece of paper that shows you, here's what you received day 1. And then here's the other piece of paper you would have received if you were a customer, year 10. And then the other piece of paper you would have received, at this point in time. So they start to feel the lack of relationship, the putting themselves in the customer's shoes a little bit more. So I think those are the types of things that I think have been important from a storytelling and perspective of selling things and why we need to make change and I've heard that feedback from executives who have to approve the funding to make some of these changes. It's one thing to hear it. It's another thing to really put yourself in the customer's shoes and feel it. So that kind of multidimensional storytelling, I think, is one aspect, and kind of seeking those little nuggets, those quotes, those, things that leave a lasting impression more so than just, the black and white facts on the ground.
And I imagine that feedback is pretty raw. One of the other guests was mentioning the other day that, what if we were either what if or should we all be judged on how we treat, customer service reps, or even if they're like bots and they're not real. And I mean, that was a gut check to me of I am probably least friendly in that domain.
Yeah.
I can be, not my best self.
Well, you're not alone in that.
Yeah. And so anyway, that was.
Yeah. But I would say the other place that I think the EQ has mattered a lot is just building partnerships. You can't get anything done alone. And it's been natural, but an important lesson in terms of the more you can help people along the way, whether that's your peers, your superiors, or the people who report to you, the more you can help people along the way, the stronger those bonds are. And you might be surprised when that comes in handy, when someone's word matters, when you need help yourself to get something done. And so not only have those partnerships and relationships been just enriching throughout my career, and almost I would say the most important part, what I do what matters way less to me than who I'm with and the experience of, how it feels to be working on this together. So I think that has been critical and
how did you develop these skills? I mean, how did you get so good at EQ? Or do you feel like certainly we can all learn at least skills to do it better, but is it inherent in who we are? Were there formative experiences there? Because you're right. You are a deeply empathetic person.
I don't know how to answer that necessarily. I think on a practical level, I would say something that has helped me is to start, for instance, if there's something a presentation I'm trying to build, I always try and start with what are the driving questions the other person who is receiving this information has. So I'm not just going to tell you what I want to tell you and however many, pages or slides I want to put it in. I'm going to start by thinking about what are the driving questions you're bringing to the table? Why would we do this? How much is it going to cost? When are you going to get it done? How are you going to get it done? Whatever. And that actually becomes a really interesting fodder for creating an outline and driving the agenda. So I let what I believe other people would be interested in formulate, the direction I go in terms of how I tell those stories. In my professional life, I think personally, it just starts with curiosity. Like, do you care? Are you curious? Are you curious beyond the surface level? Everyone's got something below that. You just got to crack the creme brulee. Sometimes it's a little deeper. It's a little thicker shell than others, but there's always something more interesting below that surface level, more connecting, more intriguing, more richly textured and layered in who that person is and what your relationship could be, even if it's just, someone you interact with on a cursory level at, your kid's school. Like I'm always hunting that.
It's a great nugget. I was sitting here thinking our country could use more curiosity. I don't know that that's often the first word people say. They talk about the polarization and this and that, but if we just be more curious to get below the surface and what's driving these things, these feelings, these opinions in people.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of that, I think one of the more rich experiences I've had in building empathy and building understanding has been actually in the political sphere. Like we've got this group here in Atlanta that meets regularly to talk about politics. It's a group of women, and it's fluid, and there's a different kind of constitution every time we meet. But I think some of the founding principles of that have been helpful and instructive to me in applying this elsewhere in my life as well. And the intent is not to teach or convince or to debate, but rather to understand and to learn and to approach it with humility and curiosity. And I think if you come at even very charged subjects and remain grounded in those things, you'd be amazed what you can uncover. And I have been amazed at what I have uncovered. And it certainly hasn't been this magic wand. All of a sudden I'm transformed into thinking a totally different way about something, but it has absolutely created more gray space between the black and white opinions of things that are so easy to gravitate towards in this culture. And in appreciating the gray space, I think it prevents us from othering so easily. It's less of an us versus them. And at minimum, as you expand your worldview that way and understand more of why they think the way they do, build empathy for or sympathy for their point of view, it becomes less threatening, less alienating. We can all kind of see more of the kaleidoscope of it. So I think of building empathy in that way. I also think that lately it's been a wild few years personally, and a lot of curveballs. And every time something, empirically bad happens, I think about, it's building my empathy. I'm learning so much about what I can empathize with in the human condition and other people going through, these types of experiences going forward. So, been growing a lot in empathy the last few years.
Isn't that true? Like I reflect often, when we're young, we're so idealistic, and that's so beautiful, and that's an important part of like coming of age. Mm-hmm. And I still have a lot of strongly held opinions, but I had more then. And as you grow, I think particularly for me anyway, and I've got a great family, but in marriage and with kids, you develop humility and empathy. And things that I used to look at and judge, I now say, I understand.
Yeah.
Even if I'm not at that exact place,
yeah.
I've tasted enough.
Yes.
It's like, I understand. And
or even if you don't understand, I understand enough not to judge it.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And I think hopefully the older you get, the more that develops, but it's not always the case. And
yeah.
I'm sure I still have a lot of sharp edges that are going to be painfully removed, perhaps. Seems to be the trend in my life.
I don't know.
It takes a lot. I can be bullheaded, but go ahead.
For what it's worth, I think about sharp edges like sea glass. Very, very rarely are they solved quickly and through blunt force.
Yeah.
That is a process of honing. And I think the more you create contact with those situations, the more you rub against it and try and, deal with the daily crash of those waves.
Yeah.
It can soften over time.
Yeah, that's helpful because there's some
you get a lot of practice.
Things I'm working through in life that it feels like it's 2 steps forward and 1.5 back, or maybe more than 1.5, and you think, oh my goodness, is this worth it?
Yeah.
But it's hard to change some of those. Well, let's pivot a little bit. I mean, we're in the arena of this, but just thinking creativity. When it comes to that, where have you experienced your best thinking creativity? And I love this too, because they both apply to both, but I do think about your, creative life, poetry, art, whatever, and then your business life. Is there a context or environment? Are there practices? Are there things you do where you're like, consistently I find that I'm most in touch, most alive. I'm my sharpest. I'm my most empathetic if these things hold true.
Well, for what it's worth, I think creativity has a place in both of those spaces.
Yeah.
And can be a superpower in the latter, specifically because of maybe the perception of scarcity there. So I'm always surprised at how consistent this is actually for me, and regardless of where I'm applying it. I think creativity, I believe, comes from pouring in, fueling
pouring into
yourself.
Yeah.
And then creating space to have an output. So, one of the things I've been thinking about is being more intentional in how I feed myself, not like literally health food wise, but rather creativity wise. So that looks like making space and taking margin to go to a museum or to, read a book or to go on a walk in nature. Like there's simple, free, and expensive things traveling as well that you can do to try and like feed your eyes. And I think the more that you see, the more you experience, we're just so kinetic. Like you have a natural reaction to these things. I took my daughter to the Nutcracker the other day and I was dying because she was sitting on my lap, and halfway through the performance, she started moving her arms and her legs and like dancing in reaction to the Sugar Plum Fairies dancing. And I had to like stifle her below the line of visibility. And she was still moving her fingers and her toes. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just love this. So I think part of creativity is putting yourself in the way of some of those things that are going to move you, and learning what that is for you individually. So I try and do an intentional job of that. I think I find that I do my best solving by first processing with noise, which sounds a little crazy. But I am not often in silence. I actually actively avoid it for the most part. It's kind of overwhelming to me. And I've found that as I've started to deconstruct why that is, I spend a lot of time intaking. And I think I'm processing in the level below that. So I'm listening to books, I'm listening to podcasts, I'm listening to, television. There's a lot of different things, music, whatever. I'm taking in information, and then I save silence for solving. So I spend time kind of like putting what's happening in the background is as I'm listening to other things or kind of going about my day is like I'm actually playing different scenarios. I'm kind of chewing on different ideas. I'm trying to like follow that rabbit trail down to like what's actually at the heart of that thing. And a lot of that I find happens a little bit more subconsciously than I expected. But when it's actually time to put the pieces together and to say like, what's the story? What's the solution? What are we going to do about this? Or write or, do something more thoughtful in terms of an output, then everything goes off. Then I need creative space and time and quiet to focus and to orchestrate. How do we put all these pieces back together? So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a little bit of the process.
So that is a period of silence for you as you output.
Yeah. I can't do that with noise, I've noticed. I have to tone it all down. But until then, it's very loud.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true for me. I think it's true for a lot of the folks that, we've spoken to about this. Yeah, for me, I had this experience about a month ago where I was out in nature for 3 or 4 nights, and I was listening to a lot of podcasts. I took in a lot of content. I noticed 2 things. One, I think being in nature helps, but one, actually just having a single source of input was less than my normal day. So I felt like I could focus more,
Yeah.
rather than 5 screens open with email and whatever, just listen to, but then I would do interspersed periods of silence that helped me then synthesize and kind of draw those connections between the things I was hearing. And to your point, I've got to be fair that it wasn't silent, but sometimes my mind will wander in the middle of an input and then I start thinking and making connections. So there is some part of me that's shutting off to, I think, get what probably my body and brain knows it needs to be able to form those connections.
Yeah. And I've recently been thinking about this in kind of a funny mental picture, which is I don't always trust my brain with silence. Like I don't trust it enough to run rampant with quiet all the time. I think it's too prone to catastrophize. It's too prone to get out of hand and sometimes wildly out of hand. And so it's almost like through consuming all this content, while some of it is very edifying and some of it is very just entertaining and meaningless, it's almost like I'm sitting my brain in front of, like a naughty child in front of the television and just saying, like, you stay put here for a while while I go do the things I need to do.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a little bit of like artful distraction that's happening in a way that's saying, like, I'm going to contain a little bit of this piece that has a likelihood to run away and become unproductive so that I can be more quietly productive just under the frequency of, that thing that's happening on the outside.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's fair. I've been thinking a lot about the different types of silence. There's certainly audible. I think that's what comes to mind first. There is some kind of silence of the brain where I think it's like quieting that monkey mind, which I think is what you're alluding to with trying to distract it, because I think this is true for many of, it's a bit scary or unnerving what happens when it is totally silent. Like, do I like those thoughts that are coming up, or do I just like, maybe it's not even the content of the thought, but just that my mind is just racing with all this stuff. And so that I find that can be a bit unnerving. But then there is, silence of the mind, which maybe can be achieved by distracting part of it so that another part can work. There's silence of the heart, which may relate to just emotions, like how am I connected emotionally? Am I being driven by emotions, or do I feel pretty emotionally even keeled? Like you, well, it's interesting what you said, because I look at you as a very even keeled, calm, collected person, which I envy. My emotions feel more volatile, like up and down. And yet, to be honest, I try to portray this calm, cool, collected, which I think in some environments I do better than others. But like you said, but even if I'm doing that beneath the surface, I'm very, it's a volatile environment. So of the heart, and then physically, am I silent? Like, am I moving? Am I still? And there's probably other ways too. But so I think that it is multifaceted, and it doesn't have to be simply audible silent. Yeah. But sorry, one more is I was thinking. So when I exercise, I often will listen to podcasts. And I've been thinking about this idea of silence, obviously doing this podcast a lot. And am I actually, hopefully I'm not preaching this, but am I practicing it? Am I practicing what I'm preaching, or at least talking about? But I thought too, is just listening to music, while it's not an audible form of silence, it is silence for my brain a little bit. It's like the background noise that then I can then process.
Yeah.
And so if I want to keep the monkeys at bay, though I think there needs to be time and place for that. Often, unfortunately for me, it's like 3 a.m. when I have to work through the monkeys.
You and me both.
Right. But music can be that kind of background where I do actually feel fairly silent and can process and synthesize. So anyway, that was a lot. I'm sorry, but
No, that was good.
those are some of my reflections.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of what silence infers is a sense of peace. And I think there's, that's why it feels so scary, I think sometimes, is how to access that peace, right? It takes a lot of kind of whacking your way through the thicket of everything else to get to that place. And I think there's a lot of different strategies to get there and a lot of different versions of it. You might feel peace in your brain, but not in your heart, and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, and we have all these inputs and for, all these emotions. And a lot of times it's like, I don't have time to deal with this. And you just shove them all down and you build up this big well of them. And then I think that's what happens is then you get silent and you're like, oh my gosh, there's all this stuff I haven't thought about or processed or dealt with. I don't even mean like long-term stuff. It's just like, things that happened the last 5 days. And that's often when I can't go to sleep. It's like, there's a bunch of stuff that somewhere down deep saying like, I need to kind of work this through. I'm like, I don't have time for that. I gotta go to bed or I gotta do this.
Yeah, I actually haven't, I don't know that I've experienced that. I don't think I'm capable of pushing it down. I think my instinct is always to tease it out. Like, how do I understand this? How do I pick it apart? And it comes with its own set of problems because then I'm wrestling it until it's tamed. So not that that's necessarily a better way to go about it, but feelings have always just been way too buoyant for me. They can't live. I mean, I process things below the surface, but they can't stay down for that long.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think it's just like there's so many inputs coming at us every day in this season of life. You don't have the time or space to process them in the moment. And so at some point you do have to go back to them. Well, you don't have to, but it feels like if you don't, I don't know, there's something missing. So how about inspiration? What's inspiring to you in this season of life? I know you just did an amazing, inspiring trip. And you and your family are great adventurers, which I imagine is inspiring. But anyway, I don't want to seed it. What inspires you?
Lately, I would say I'm very inspired by people who are brave enough to take the risk to share who they really are. And I think I see that in context of art. I see that in context of music, and I have really been noticing lately the difference between more raw emotion, more vulnerable, authentic expression and more genericized, safe versions of that. So you take like the equivalent would be, or a parallel would be, the pop song that has the generic, my heart is broken lyrics versus, I really like Noah Kahan these days, and he'll go deep on. We now like
him because you all like him.
On like all the perils of, depression and, all the layers of human experience. And I just think, God, that's so brave to put that version of yourself that is not polished, that is not pristine, out there. And yet that is the foundation of connection. I think that moves us when we see other people risking that and sharing, what feels real and true. And I think that inspires us to be, more authentic. So I think I'm inspired by that a lot. I think that's what's most moving in any form of art.
Is that authenticity, vulnerability?
Yeah,
both?
I think both.
Yeah.
It's even going to the ballet, even going to, theater performances. I just love being in those spaces because you know that these people who are on the stage are just living the most full expression of who they were meant to be and like so deeply in their lane. And I find that inspiring aside from the beauty of what they're creating. I just think I've been thinking a lot about the role of art in the world. Like why does it exist? Why is it less valued than other things in society? What would it be like if we didn't have it? Because there's so many versions of it. There's such an array of different expressions of artistic talents and experience. And I just think we would be so much worse off without everyone expressing their art, whatever form that takes. So I think I'm just very inspired by experiencing and taking in all of that in its many different forms. And then the people behind that, what it took for them to risk judgment, risk alienation, risk misunderstanding, risk, all kinds of things.
And does that make you want to do that more? I mean, I feel like we started by saying, it may be good to keep this over here and this over here. But these people that are living into it for their livelihood, day in, day out, or do you think about it differently?
Yeah, it's an interesting question to circle back to. I admire people who are able to so clearly live into it. I don't know that it needs to be that way. But it does, to answer your question, it does inspire me to do more of it. Like I do think that there's a volume, there's a quantity inspiration, there's a quality inspiration there that feels separate to me from the livelihood question. And yet those things might eventually intertwine, you know, as you do more and more of it. Maybe that is the fullest version of you and, worth the risk at some point.
We've talked about some, not you and I, but with other guests of like the qualities of the best creativity, and does it need to be separate from financial incentive? Is there a purity to it where it's just an expression coming out and not, not pulled out by the hope of return or even fame or power? It doesn't have to be financial. What are your thoughts on that? And then I'm, because I do think that speaks also to like this purity of like hobby versus like I was speaking to somebody the other day who's in the creative field financially, and we were talking about this tension, and even like with designers, graphic designers, which is a great example because, they're these artists and yet they're like then serving a client and the client's vision. And they get to bring some art to the table, but it's very restrained. But they have to make a living. But anyway, so thoughts on that?
I mean, I think creativity elevates most things. So I think what they're what you just described, I think what they're bringing to the table is probably elevating the finished product.
It's better than not having it. Yes.
Yes. And yet I was reading something this week about how counterproductive perfectionism is to creativity, and how the perfectionist is creating with one eye on their audience. And I thought that was so interesting and such a keen observation and insight. And I think that's part of the risk that you feel if you are doing your art or you're expressing your creativity in service of a client, someone else, a job. There is this self-consciousness about it and judgment inherently related to it and baked into it, which that's not inherently bad. Like judgment, criticism, critique is a part of the artistic process, a part of the creative process, and I would argue an essential one. But it's all about the balance and the weighting of these things, So I think of creativity as this cycle. Are you putting enough in to your human experience to remain inspired, to find those points of connection, to build your context personally and your library, your repertoire of what you're drawing on? Are you creating space to express it And are you iterating based on what you're learning in your life or feedback you're receiving? So there is a virtuous cycle, I think, that can be applied either professionally or personally there. And, I'm sure it just lands on people differently based on how much you can take of either one of any weighting of that trifecta, and how it's showing up.
Yeah. I think the feedback and iteration is important. And yet, I've been inspired lately by Rick Rubin, Creative Act, even hearing him on subsequent podcasts, and, just talking about, I think his gift is actually finding the authentic artistic expression, right? Because I don't even think he reads music. He doesn't play. He just knows the true when he sees it. It's like a tuning fork. Yeah. And I think that's why he's successful. And, and he's talked about when he's worked with artists and all of a sudden, and I think this happens in any creative pursuit, you start creating art in reaction to an audience with them in mind rather than your true expression. And then he's like, it loses it. Yeah. It loses the power. And to, name a cliche or to give a cliche expression, I think a little about Steve Jobs. I think his perspective at one point was, because a lot of people say, well, look at what the market needs and then go fill that need. And he's like, I don't think the market knows they need this. I'm going to build it. And there was some beautiful creative part of it. And then I'm sure there's 1,000 examples of people doing that doesn't work, but maybe it works for them as just the pure creative outlet.
Well, I think about that a lot when I write, actually, what you're talking about in terms of the relationship to the audience. There's a self-consciousness to it if you are sharing your art, period. But the more I can separate the act of creating from the act of sharing, the better off I think I am, because it always has felt most productive to me and most true and resonant in writing for myself, period. And I've found that as I've started to share more, it comes with a risk of self-editing. And there can be an element of that, a self-awareness of that, and a feedback cycle of that can be productive, and a dose of that that's healthy. But the risk is to let that take over. And I've had an interesting experience over the last year of sharing more, in that the more I have, the times that I have felt really scared to hit publish, the times that I have felt ooh, this reveals a little more about me than people know, or more of the layers, more of how I really feel. I'm happy to talk about, and I'm very open if someone is interested, but I don't, broadcast and show up with on the surface necessarily. And every time I have worked to remain more inside out than outside in on that, and, take the leap of being authentic, I have found that has resonated far more with people and driven much more connection than the times I have played it safe and said, ooh, I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to, I don't want them to think this about me. So I'm just going to put this out there that doesn't feel so personal. So I do think there is something really powerful about the more authentic, true, unvarnished we can be with each other. It engenders connection, and it engenders, I've found, similar kinetic reactions in other people being willing to share back.
I agree. Yeah, I was going to say that's why I keep coming back to your poetry. I mean, I come back honestly as a friend, but I think that only takes it so far. And I love that you risk and are vulnerable. That's the most powerful stuff. And often when I'm like, oh, that makes me a little uncomfortable. Not about who you are, but I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I share that.
Yeah, I know.
But I love that she put it out there. And we were talking the other day of I'm trying to think of does creativity, or at least good creativity, require risk? So I've been thinking about that, and right now I would say I think it does, but that's what you're doing. you're risking and being vulnerable. And that's part of why it's really great.
Well, thank you. That's kind, but it is something time will tell. There's absolutely risk inherent there, and I grapple with that all the time. It doesn't get magically easier, but it is a muscle you build, I think, to be both willing to exercise it and ready to receive whatever comes back, and not be so porous to negativity, to create and keep that separation of self.
Have you heard
versus
negative
others.
feedback? Have people given you negative feedback on it?
Not directly. But, I am aware that there are things that might not connect, that might offend, that it also feels complicated to be a professional and be so personal. You know what I mean? There's a level of discoverability there that feels risky. And yet the equation I keep running, and time will tell if this is the right one, is I would rather be known and connected. And I feel very strongly, even in my professional life, I only thrive and choose to live in spaces where I can be my authentic self. And the environments that conflict with that, I don't choose.
That aligns with how I know you. I lost my train of thought. I wanted to keep going on the poetry. Oh, I know what I was going to say. It's just that I'm inspired that you do it.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah. Well, I think it's helped me take this creative risk.
I love that.
I think there's probably a lot of other folks that, look and are inspired, and hopefully it inspires more creative risk and more vulnerability, as you'd say.
Yeah. What's so interesting is I think the beauty of creativity and the arts is that it is so subjective. There isn't a clear right, wrong, good, bad. Yes, there are things that are more successful and celebrated than others. But I think as long as there is authenticity, then it is good.
If it's true.
If it's true,
I agree.
then that's its own barometer. That's its own benchmark. And I've been thinking a lot about, I listened to another podcast recently where Andrew Garfield, the actor, was talking about what is kind of the purpose of life, and he was talking about how it's just to be your most authentic self. It's just to be if you got to the end of the world and you died and they said, well, did you do it? Were you Rob? Were you the fullest expression of Rob? Because that, I think I've latched onto as the bar. That feels very resonant within me, that it's not to be this cookie cutter, whatever. And in that sense, then it feels less risky to be more vulnerable and authentic. If you are in pursuit of being the most full expression of your time, your talents, your individual constitution, the constellation of things that has shaped you to be who you are and meant to be, and the role you're meant to play. If you're playing that role in the universe, that's success.
I like that.
So I applaud you for taking risks.
Thank you.
This is fun to see you living into more full expression of your personality.
Thank you. Well, you guys are the stars, so I appreciate your time. I agree. Yeah, it makes me think true self, false self, and there's a lot of writing about that in psychology and spirituality, and that seems to be a really important dynamic, discovering that true self and then being that. So, all right, turning a bit. I've been, thinking about this phrase, elevated thinking. In our world, or at least the U.S., I feel like it's having a hard time, and just the quality of our thinking. As you think about that term, elevated thinking, or think about, you can define it how you want, but greater thinking, better thinking, but not obviously specific to one problem. But what does that look like to you? I mean, you're a great thinker. What are the characteristics of thoughtfulness and great thinking? I mean, and we've touched on some, but
I think.
Let me interrupt. Add one more thing. Without making it political, but if there's attribute, like you named one, curiosity. Are there other things where you're like, man, as I look across friends, family, humanity, the country, I wish I could just turn the dial up on a couple of these things to elevate our thinking? Are there things that come to mind?
It's such an interesting question. I think elevating thinking, as I ponder that, feels like it requires an ability to sit in discomfort. You have to take the time to really try and understand, and to try and understand things that aren't convenient for you to unearth, to try and understand that things that may not make sense at first blush, or be offensive or confusing or threatening. I think about it as like, to have elevated thinking, you really have to build a map of all different types of input, and then try and find the patterns and the solutions that lie in the very unique connections that aren't obvious. Like, I think that's the difference between elevated thinking and sometimes the baser instincts we reach towards as a society. Is there's black and white, and those are obvious. It's obvious why people gravitate to those, because it's clean and it's easy and it's simple and it solves it. And, it's safe. It's a very easily integrated, easily understood narrative and explanation of the world. And sometimes a foundation for belonging. If you think XYZ, then you can be a part of this tribe, this group that all is going to sing from the same hymnal, whatever you want to define that. Religion, politics, there's all different versions of that in society. But I think to one step beyond that is something much richer, which is an appreciation for how not black and white the world is, how rarely clean, the decision-making and narratives and solutions are. So, but that's uncomfortable. That's uncomfortable to say, I'm going to step outside of this very tidy narrative and space and grapple with the universe of all the things it could be. That's, not this easy thing to grasp onto. So I think that's part of it, or at least that's what comes to mind initially.
There's a lot there. Like we could do some time on that. I agree. I think about, the tribalism. I'm playing amateur something here, but I think it's like in our DNA, right? Like that's, it meant safety for us, many moons ago. Mm-hmm. And that's still in there of like safety. We want to be safe with this community. And so I understand it, and yet it's a big obstacle. I feel it in Atlanta. We have a great community of friends who I love so dearly. And yet there's some ways that I want to be, I feel like the truest expression of myself is different from some of those held norms. And so I want to be different, and I value that. And then yet sometimes it feels lonely. Mm-hmm. And so I feel this tension of like, I want to just fit in like everybody else to this group. And yet there's part of me that doesn't, if I'm being true to myself. And I both like that and fear that.
Yeah. I mean, I think absolutely. We all on a base instinctual level want to be safe, and there's safety in numbers. And we also want to be right. And I think it's easy to feel secure that you're on the right path if a lot of other people are feeling or thinking or saying the same things as you. It's not so individually risky. And yet I think the reality is if you step outside of, if you can brave stepping outside of the pack and say, hey, I will risk all of this and acknowledge that I don't know what's right. Like that's a very scary place to be, but I think a more honest one in a lot of these realms, because who knows who's right? I mean, there's a lot of ways to solve problems. There's a lot of ways to approach things, and I think there's a lot of valid reasons why people think and feel and have diagnosed their worldview the way they have. That I may or may not be able to relate to, but I can certainly appreciate. And so there's a hubris to believing you're right. There's a hubris to being, so black and white. And I think it's, latch onto that and live by it at your own peril.
Yeah, I like the idea. My wiring then directs me to like the idea of being different, being the rebel, and yet emotionally it's hard.
It's very hard. Yeah.
I'm also not looking to alienate a bunch of people, but I am looking for that tension of I want to be true to myself and who I am and what I want, and yet, I want to have friends and community and be loved.
But I think, why do those things need to be so at odds today? That's something I really wish we could push past, is like you can be anchored in a space and feel a part of a community and yet diverge in places and yet appreciate more of the gray. Like there's...
Yeah, I think different is scary, unfortunately.
For all of
us.
All of mankind and for all of time.
And there's probably hard wiring for that. But hey, let me go back and pull on a thread of something you said. So you're defining elevated thinking, multiple inputs. It's not just black and white to arrive at the right solution. What are the attributes of the right solution? Are there universal things you come to? I mean, obviously a lot of it's context dependent and what's the problem. But something sparked there and
Yeah, I think this is going to sound basic, but I think...
For an elevated thinking problem, what are the elevated attributes of the solution? Sorry.
Yeah,
I wanted to reframe.
That's a good guide. Again, I would say this is going to sound basic, but I think to arrive at the right solution, you have to have named the root of the problem, period. Which is so easy to bypass, actually. Like, it's so easy to say...
Talk about that.
We think the problem is this, or to not really understand the problem statement, or to not have a common understanding of the problem statement, or to not double click a few layers below to understand what's the root of that problem that is leading to the symptoms you're experiencing as the problem statement. So I actually think there's a lot of excavation at the heart of solving things the right way that has to happen first, and not everyone has the patience for.
Well said. Go a little further. So how, because this is really interesting. So I agree. Most of us stop at level 1 or 2. What drives you, or how do you know when you're back to, I think about the term first principles. I don't know if that's the right application here, but how do you know when you're back at like the base foundational element of a problem, and that's the thing to solve? Is it just instinct? Well,
I think there is a sense of click, like, okay,
feels right.
This feels like it's, the cipher clicking into place. Yeah. So there is a bit of instinct there. But I think first it starts, for me at least, with looking, maybe a little bit more broadly on like, this is how it's showing up. Are there other ways this is showing up? So you can look at that in a business context or in an interpersonal context. But, this is where it's showing up. This is and then treat it as a symptom. Don't take for granted that it's the problem. And if you can build a little bit of horizontal context around, like, are there other places this is reaching the surface? And then you start to go vertical in my mind and like dig down into it. That's a matter of questioning why, in my opinion. So showing up here, why? Why? I mean, not rocket science, but when you do that kind of interrogation, you might be surprised the type of things that are actually at the heart of that. I've experienced that personally as you like really try and understand, why am I acting this way, or why am I reacting this way to
That's
something?
a good one. Yeah.
More specifically and more commonly. But then also in business, as you're looking across, like, why is that happening? Why are they feeling this way? Why is this showing up? Why is this taking so long? And there's always more to the equation than meets the eye, in my opinion. Or in my experience. So I keep trying to build that context map of like, where are all the places that it's showing up, and then why, how deep can I go in pinpointing the root of that? And then my brain works diagnostically. Like, I really like taking a broad swath of quantitative, qualitative inputs and trying to find the patterns within them. So then it becomes a process of bucketing. Like, here's all the themes that are coming out. Here's all the commonalities I'm seeing across these different data points, again, personally or professionally. And then how might we summarize and synthesize this into a more concise and insightful problem statement? Like, here's what we think is actually happening and why. And I think the other piece of that equation is making sure that there's agreement and some consensus, depending on who the important parties are, that you're just not off on an island solving, unless it's something very intrapersonal, like that you're not off on an island solving a problem that no one else agrees is a problem. Or building solutions for things that people don't agree are problems. That's one of my favorite things to observe, is like solutions hunting for problems. You're doing this backwards. We got to find the real root of the issue. And then that's where I think all really impactful creativity and problem solving comes from, is once you've gotten down several clicks below the surface to what the heart of the thing is. And only then, in my opinion, can you construct changes, iterations, solutions, transformation that actually sticks and matters.
And is humanity always at the end of that? Like, are humans always the ultimate? I mean, I heard that a little bit almost in what you said earlier with, in my business world, it's so, in my business life, it's so important to get back to how are humans experiencing this?
Yeah.
Is that always true?
Well,
if we keep going?
At this specific moment in time, I think humans are driving a lot of what's happening.
Yeah.
We may be on a tipping point for that right
fair
now.
Enough.
So
I wasn't thinking about that, but fair enough.
I don't know that will be true, but I do think if you really trace things back, if you keep excavating, it's not often that people have bad intentions. It's almost never that. It is far more often they are just trying to do something else or accomplish certain, things a certain way, or it's not a priority, or it is a priority, or it has unintended consequences. And I think, there is an element of humanity that's at the heart of all of it. And getting clear on the problem, being able to articulate the impact, and being able to agree that this is something that should be solved is the root of getting even those people all the way down the chain to get on board with fixing it. If you can't do that, they're not going to change what they're doing.
All right, let me see if I could take this a step further and not create confusion. So if indeed humanity is at the end of every problem we're trying to solve, are there core values that are then important to tie into at the very end for humans and the human condition?
In a business context, in a personal context?
Well, I guess I'm wondering if it applies to all of the above, if you keep going. And maybe this isn't the right way to get at all this, but but it's like, is at the end of every problem how it affects humans. And then at the end of that, is it, what do humans fundamentally need?
That's an interesting challenge. I mean, it's hard for me as I'm hearing you articulate that. I'm cycling through all these different examples, and it's hard for me to find one that doesn't ultimately result in that. At the end of the day,
it's all for us.
It all impacts us. And, honestly, I've been thinking about like what this sounds so esoteric, but why do we all run around doing the jobs that we do on this planet? What is all of this about? And yes, there's stressors and there's things that matter and there's things that make from a practical level, the world that we live in go round. But I don't know that any of that really matters that much. At the end of the day, I think what people realize at the end of their lives, what people realize in times of crisis is what matters at the end of the day is each other and our relationships with each other and our connectedness. And I think that's why things like tribalism are so important, is because they provide a foundation of feeling connected and belonging to people. And wherever you find that, I think that is actually, one of the most powerful forces in our world. And one of the things that seems to be inherently resilient and true when you cancel out all the other noise.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about is like transcendent values.
Mm-hmm.
And really at the end of the day, to your point about like kind of what's all this about, is it in fact, this is something I've thought about, is it in fact to kind of increase it's hard to put this into words, like increase the energy and amount of transcendent values that are out there. And so for every thing I do during my day, is the end of it grounded in communicating, elevating, energizing a transcendent value. And then we could, talk about what those are. But, courage, faith, wisdom, truth, grace, forgiveness, love, maybe the biggest. And so, yeah, I'm on my computer and I'm doing an email and it's about, it feels so far removed, but at the end of it, is that the ultimate purpose is to, better a human, care for a human, help that human thrive, or humans, depending. And so I've just been playing a little bit of this game of, can I actually frame my day? And it's so hard to stay connected to this because you get in the flow. But if, like in each conversation, in each moment, am I holding these transcendent values in mind, where I may have to have a tough conversation with you because you made a business mistake or whatever? Am I keeping your humanity in mind? And ultimately, I hope this is like a edifying conversation that instills courage, humility, truth, a knowledge of self. And can everything I do during the day, or does everything I do during the day, tie back to that ultimately? And can I keep that in mind? I mean, it's maybe hard to keep that first in mind, but so anyway, humanizing our business environments and again, a little bit of like, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
Now I have faith and that informs a lot of that, but practically, what's that look like? And I think it's trying to help and care for and better my fellow human, and business is just like many layers on top of that. But anyway, yes. I don't know. Have I gone off the reservation here?
No, I understand. But could it be as simple as just the mission is to make things better? In whatever form that takes, that might look like helping each other. That might look like getting something done. But I think all those things that you just described, I think to me, could be summed up in, I don't think our mission is that grand necessarily, or that needs to be that ambitious in a capitalist sense or a, American worldview sense, but rather, am I making things better?
Yeah. For me, one of the tensions is, as I get older, is this about me or them? And,
what do you mean?
Well, so I've mentioned this in several episodes, but this idea of like the ego, not the it can go to this place, but not the ego like I'm braggadocious and whatever, but my preferences, my way, my understanding. Am I furthering that by what I'm doing? Or do I have the other person in mind first? And what I've been wrestling with is trying to loosen the grip perhaps on my ego. I don't want to lose it. It's important to have my identity. But as I get older, and certainly I think we'd both say we've experienced this, like when you're married and when you have kids and, and then when you have friends and do all the things, but it's like you're letting go of your way of understanding, preferences. You're letting go of you, I think. Again, not identity, but is it my way?
Well, can both be true at the same time? Can you have conviction in your way and yet freedom and space to not control the outcome? I think that those, especially as you get older and you develop more experience and more conviction based on what you've seen works or doesn't work, like there might be some real expertise there that is not worth throwing out in favor of just whatever anyone wants to
totally
do.
Agree.
And yet, it also becomes untenable and exhausting to try and maintain control of all the things in a way that meets your standards and is done the way that you would want to do it. I just think both things can be true. You can become deeper connected to your conviction of, your worldview of the right way to do things, and at the same time release more of the need to spin all those plates yourself as an act of self-survival and sustainability.
Yes. And I think further than that, for that person's benefit. I mean, there's a piece of it is, am I serving myself or them? And listen, we both had this experience. I think it's a good one or a good analogy where somebody who's less experienced on your team and they mess something up. And maybe it reflects poorly on you or your business, your bottom line. And it's like, okay, is this moment about those things or is it a learning moment for them? And in some sense, they hopefully all work together, but where I can let go of maybe my first priority and say, this should be about you. This moment should be about you. And then hopefully that they all work together beautifully in the end. But
well, and I think part of that is remembering, what is my job here? Am I doing your job for you? Am I doing my job? And I think the most acute experience I've had of that recently was actually a parenting one. I ran an experiment with the kids because I was trying to release similarly more of this control. And my instinct would be, we're going on a trip. I'm going to prepare and I'm going to pack for you. And, I'm going to get your involvement in it, but I'm going to make sure this gets over the finish line because I'm going to, control every step of the way. And instead, I took a moment and wrote down not a list of all they needed to bring, but rather described the destination, which was you need something to sleep in. We are going to be gone for 4 days. You need something to keep you warm at night. And then I gave them that list, and they all relished the independence. I was shocked by their reaction. They really responded well to being empowered in that way. And I was shocked at my reaction, which is, rather than be stressed out and deal with the burden of carrying all these things for them, watching them learn to carry it themselves, they came to me with questions throughout, like, well, when you say something to sleep in at night, do you mean like a sleeping bag or pajamas? And I was like, well, what do you think?
Good question.
What do you think? So I found myself being more encouraging and curious and, asking, not telling them, which is like something I know to do, but is hard to reach for in certain business contexts and times. And so we got to the point where, this is a relatively low risk space, but they packed all their bags. They forgot some things. They certainly did it differently than I would have, had I been able to control the process and do it my way. And yet it wasn't wrong. It wasn't bad. It certainly wasn't catastrophic. And so that was a calculated risk, being able to give something that wouldn't, be impossible to fix. And yet it was so instructive for me, and I think has continued to be an enduring model as I think of those types of situations in both a parenting and a professional context of like, hey, define the outcome, not the process. Let them find their way, be a sounding board through that, but really like trying to lean more into that independence and empowerment and be there to help support the outcome. You know what I mean? Like not control it, but support it and fix it if it needs remedying.
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I hear in that, you were leaning into those higher order values and you had a way you could do it, but you were releasing your grip on that.
It's hard to do.
For something deeper and better, which is your children having autonomy, feeling that freedom and empowerment and learning
and also for me, not carrying what's theirs to carry.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting parsing and analysis of like, where am I being redundant of other people? Where am I doing my job and where am I trying to do their job?
Yeah. Well, and this just gets to, I think in our season of life, plus maybe another 5 to 10 years, but we're getting to these places where, you've got enough experience under your belt. It's like, I kind of know how I want to do things. And perhaps even like, this is the way it should be done. And so then what's the next step of growth? And I think the curiosity thing was a beautiful, or that's a beautiful part of this. But how do we keep growing where we've reached some success in life? We have our methods and processes and frameworks, and it's like, this is how it works. And then to say, there may be some others that work. I think that's what I hear you saying is like to continue to be curious of, I know how to do it pretty well, and yet I'm humble enough to know there's some other things I can keep learning and integrating.
Yeah. I mean, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about safety. Like leaning on what I feel most confident in will work, feels safe. And yet there's a lot more richness to be experienced if I'm willing to step outside of what's safe. So safe comes with consequences of its own. There's a lot of risks to playing it safe. There's a lot of risks to not evolving. So I think being willing to have the humility to say, like, I know this, my instinct is to reach for my way of doing things and to try like hell to override that at times. It doesn't come naturally. It is a very intentional effort because it is the thing we are going to reach for most often because it feels safe. And, that is very compelling.
So well said. Well, I know we need to wrap. I've got 2 more questions.
Sure.
One a big one, one an easy one. Well, or a little one. Life's work. How do you think about what is my life's work at this stage and season?
I think about, am I doing my best to foster creativity and connection in places that matter? I care a lot about making a difference in little ways and increasingly in bigger ways. And I'm trying to find the right channels for that to, put that energy to work.
And is your poetry, that's part of that?
I would classify that as part of that.
Will you, I meant to dive in a little deeper, and so I don't want to miss it. Will you just share a little bit about why that started, and even a little bit about what you've discovered through this process?
Sure. So I'm a bit of a reluctant writer, actually.
Though you had a very well-known blog, I've come to find out in our friendship, you were famous at one point. Stopped on the street famous. Sorry.
That feels overblown.
You may not want to wanted to go there, but.
Well, I would go back further, actually. In growing up, I've always had a creative bent, but I used to dread reading and writing. I hated it. I avoided it at all costs. And I had a teacher in high school, my AP English teacher, and I went to him one day. I said, "Mr. Reed, you've got to help me. I am miserable. I am loathing this. I can't live in dread of this all the time."
You, yeah.
And he said, this was some of the most impactful advice I ever got. He said, "Oh, well, that's interesting. Then you have to do it every day." And I was like, no, that's not what I wanted to hear. I didn't want him to tell me to do more of the thing I was hating. I wanted him to help me find a workaround out of it. And that the idea of diving in further to the problem was an interesting idea and counter to my instincts. And so I actually did take him up on it. I started writing just for myself, back in the early days of computers, which feels like the dark ages now. But I would write every day, just, teenage angst and personal soliloquies. And eventually that turned into, in college, writing a little bit more intentionally, and I found over time that uncorked something. It got me over the dam of, whatever my reluctance or negative relationship with it was, it became more natural. And it tapped into something that actually really fed me. And so I ended up becoming an English major. I studied English and art history in school, which is so
that teacher
hilarious.
Would be so proud. Or was it coach or teacher?
It was my teacher.
Yeah, teacher.
And so I found really great teachers along the way who encouraged it. And then I also found great writers who inspired me. I remember the first time I read I Know Why the Cage Birds Sing by Maya Angelou, I was like, oh, this is what language could be. That was eye-opening for me. And anyway, so through college, I studied that. And then afterwards, that was in we were living in the land of nascent blogging culture. And so somehow I got on that bandwagon, and I really, it was kind of secret at first. It was a weird thing to be public and private about it in my real life, but public about it on the internet. And yet I found I just tapped into what am I actually thinking, feeling, and it felt so good every time I would finish writing something. It feels like that peace, that rest that you talked about, the peace that silence can bring. I feel that in my heart, which sounds corny, but there really is something so satisfying to me about finding the right words for something or the right sequence. I can feel it like a cadence. I can feel it like music, if it fits, if it doesn't, if it's missing something, if it feels sound. There's an inner, metronome of that for me with writing. And so I shared in that forum. And then when I had kids, I found both I didn't have as much time, but also I felt weird publicly writing their stories for them. And I've always lived in first person narrative. I'm not a novelist. I'm not a creative writer in that sense. I'm very observational and personal about it. And so I didn't want to violate their privacy in a way. And so I put that aside, but I did feel that lacking for a decade. It was weird to let that muscle atrophy. Mm-hmm. And yet I think so many mothers experience that, parents experience that in the season. So yeah, it's been interesting over the last few years. I've come back to it in fits and starts, and specifically in the form of poetry this time rather than personal essays. And I've found it really scratches an itch for me in terms of metabolizing the things I am thinking and feeling and swimming with below the surface. And it's been an interesting experiment and experience sharing that more publicly. And I've learned that and been surprised by, for as open of a person as I feel that I am, so many people have been surprised by, I don't know, I guess I don't always want to take up so much space and like broadcast or kind of insert it, but if it's there for the taking, if anyone asks or is interested. So I don't know, it's been interesting to feel a little bit more known in that way and to grapple day to day with that kind of risk of sharing, and to try and build the muscle of both being most fully who I am, and letting that be known.
I know Rachel and I both feel like we know you better through it. So it's been a good tool in our friendship.
Well, thanks for being along for the ride.
And say real quick, I thought this was so interesting, the emotional difference between the blog and poetry because of the
forum. Yeah.
Well, and one is sending and one's drawing. Anyway.
Yeah, that was a major change for me. And it surprised me how much it landed on me, like physically in experiencing those different ways of sharing. With the blog, I felt like posting something on the bulletin board, like very passive. I would put it out there. If someone was interested, great. They would go find it. And, it was always, I think the richest piece of that was more of the community interaction. Like there was a lot of interactivity on that forum, but it was very passively sent. I would make it available into the world and, people weren't forced to interact with it if they didn't want to. And in writing poetry, I've been using Substack, which has been this new and different tool, which pushes the thing you're publishing out into everyone's inboxes, which has felt so much more imposing and invasive. And like, I almost do it like covering my eyes, like, oh, it's a cringing feeling every time I hit that. Because I don't want to impose on people in that way. And yet I've learned I just have to trust that, if they don't want to be there for it, they're not going to read it or they're not going to subscribe. And, my job is to create and to share it. And their job is to react with it however they choose. So I'm not going to carry that part of the load. And try and self-edit and carry that for them. So that's been an interesting learning.
I'm so glad you impose. I think friends probably don't impose enough, but you're a very non-imposing person. And, everybody wants more of you. So I'm glad that you're sending out a part of who you are in that.
Little missives from below the surface.
It's so great. And one other thought that jumped to mind is, you read these studies of where they go in and speak to octogenarians.
Yeah.
I don't know what you say when they're in their 90s, but anyway, older folks who are at the end of their life, and ask them, what do you wish they did different? And it's almost always, I wish I took more risk. Mm-hmm. And so here's to taking risk.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're doing it.
Thanks.
All right. As we part, a thought, a encouragement, a challenge for everybody listening. What would you leave them with?
Throw out the rubric and spend time investing in how do you become the most full expression of who you were designed to be by your own grading scale and nothing external.
Well said. Danielle, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure.